Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a scalpel to one of the most polarizing and complex areas of U.S. financial compliance, foreign bank account reporting, better known as FBAR.
Right. This is the requirement our source material often personifies as Mr. FBAR.
And we are dissecting its history, its really bizarre statutory framework, and the intense controversies surrounding its modern enforcement, particularly as it relates to Americans living outside the United States.
That's right. Our mission is critical today. We are unpacking the broad legal obligations found in 31 U.S.C. 5314, examining the specific reporting rules, and analyzing the heavy, potentially staggering implications of noncompliance.
It's been a big one.
It is. What we found in the source materials is that this is not just some arcane banking rule. For many Americans abroad, it has become a central point of, existential regulatory concern.
We have some incredible nuggets coming up that completely change how you view the IRS's power here. First, we'll cover the basic $10,000 reporting trigger, but then we jump into the surprising statutory power the Treasury Department holds to exempt entire groups.
Like Americans abroad.
Exactly, if they chose to. And here is the biggest surprise. We will dive deep into why the statute says the government may impose a civil penalty rather than must.
That single word, may, is the linchpin of the entire enforcement discretion.
Yeah.
It truly is.
Yeah.
To start, let's nail down the basics of Compliance FBAR 101.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core filing requirement applies to every U.S. citizen or resident, and they must file an FBAR annually regardless of where they reside.
The trigger is what catches people off guard. It's an aggregate total.
Not per account.
No. You must file if the combined highest balance of all your non-U.S. financial accounts, that's any account over which you have signing authority or control, reaches just $10,000 at any point during the calendar year.
$10,000? That is a remarkably low threshold when you consider how many average working people in places like Europe or Asia might easily have that much across, a checking account and a modest savings account.
And to be specific, that aggregate peak balance is calculated using the Treasury exchange rate on December 31st. And we must make a crucial distinction right here. The FBAR is often confused with, but is explicitly not the same as, Form 8938, which is filed with your income tax return under FCO rules.
Why does that distinction matter so much?
Because the forms cover different things and have different thresholds. FBAR is about accounts and has that low $10,000 threshold.
Right.
Form 8938, on the other hand, reports a broader range of specified foreign financial assets, like certain corporate interests, and its reporting thresholds are significantly higher, often $50,000 to $300,000, depending on your marital status and residency.
So FBAR is the one with the really low, easy-to-trip-over wire.
Exactly. The fact that it hits such low account balances, coupled with the complexity of reporting interests held in foreign trusts or corporations, is why it catches so many average people off guard.
That makes perfect sense. Now we get to the critique lodged in our source material regarding the shifting purpose of the FBAR rule.
Indeed. When Mr. FBAR was first established back in 1970, the original purpose was straightforward: to detect money laundering and illegal activities committed by people primarily residing in the U.S.
What the source calls homeland Americans.
Right. It was a counter-crime measure.
But the modern critique, particularly looking at enforcement in the 21st century, is extremely sharp. The analysis asserts that FBAR's purpose has radically shifted.
It has. The source, using highly charged language, describes its current application as a form of terrorism committed by the U.S. government against Americans abroad, citing high-profile cases like Baribeau and Didario as evidence of this massive punitive shift.
That is incredibly strong language.
It is, and the source backs it up by focusing on the sheer magnitude of the penalties asserted against individuals who pose little to no money laundering threat. This critique is rooted in the broad, nearly boundless legal foundation.
Right. FBAR is authorized by 31 U.S.C. 5314, which mandates that the Treasury Secretary create rules for citizens and residents to report foreign financial accounts.
And the language is vague right from the statutory beginning.
It requires reporting when a resident, citizen, or a person in and doing business in the United States maintains a relationship with a foreign financial agency. That opens the door immediately to major ambiguities we need to cover.
The first major ambiguity the source highlights is the definition of citizen itself. Does it mean citizen under immigration rules, or does it follow the definitions found in the Internal Revenue Code?
Why would there be a difference?
Well, it creates a huge gray area for people actively trying to shed their U.S. ties. For example, the specific question raised is If an individual formally relinquished U.S. citizenship under immigration laws, but does not yet possess the official documentation, a certificate of loss of nationality,
Oh, CLN, right?
are they still considered a U.S. citizen for FBAR purposes and subject to these requirements? Since the CLN process can take months or even years, that period of limbo can be terrifyingly uncertain.
That's fascinating because it means the regulatory tentacles can potentially hold on to you long after you've tried to cut the cord. Now let's look at the doing business paradox.
This is a perfect example of selective enforcement. Statutorily, the Treasury is required to inflict FBAR on a person in and doing business in the United States.
Logically, that requirement should apply to potentially millions of visitors every year. Think about a tourist or a business traveler here for a week who checks their foreign bank balance or, executes a trade online while physically standing on U.S. soil.
They are in and doing business.
Technically, yes.
Yet the source argues Treasury is clearly not requiring these millions of annual visitors to file FBARs. The fact that the statute broadly includes this group, but the regulation only targets citizens and residents, highlights the discretionary nature of the rulemaking process.
And it shows how the rules focus disproportionately on U.S. citizens abroad.
Critically, yes.
So if the application is this controversial and arguably unfair, especially to the expat community, does Treasury have any legal mechanism to ease the burden?
Yes. They have a clear statutory off-ramp they simply haven't used.
Okay.
They absolutely do, and this is one of those profound nuggets. 31 U.S.C. 5314b grants the Secretary statutory authority to prescribe a reasonable classification of persons subject to or exempt from a requirement.
So to be clear, the power to exempt Americans abroad from this compliance burden, perhaps due to the hardships of living in a foreign banking system, is explicitly written into the law.
Precisely. The Treasury can exempt Americans abroad by regulation if they chose to do so. What's fascinating here is that the political will to relieve the burden is clearly absent, which fuels the source's critique that FBAR enforcement is more about punishment and revenue than actual crime prevention.
The ultimate implementation, then, is handled by two distinct entities. FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which the source describes rather humorously as the Ministry of Love.
Right.
FinCEN sets the specific rules, but the IRS is the agency primarily responsible for auditing and assessing those terrifying penalties. This brings us directly to Section 3, the choice to punish.
This is where we pivot from what is required of the citizen to what is authorized for the government. The administering body, delegated to the IRS, interprets these rules and polices compliance up to the statutory maximums.
And the key statutory finding is in 31 U.S.C. 5321A5. This is the absolute center of the discretionary power. The statute uses the word may authorize a civil money penalty for FBAR violations.
May, not must.
There is zero legal requirement to impose a penalty for either civil non-willful or willful conduct.
The implication is massive. The IRS asserts penalties, including those huge fines we are about to discuss, because they want to, because they are authorized to under the statute, and not because they are legally compelled to. The statutes only set the ceiling for what those penalties can be.
That reframes the entire enforcement game. If the IRS is not required to impose a fine, that means every single penalty assertion, even for a non-willful violation, is an active decision. Let's detail those limits because they are staggering.
For a single non-willful violation, the maximum penalty is $10,000 per year, a limit confirmed by the Supreme Court's Bittner decision.
Okay, $10,000. But the stakes jump dramatically when the conduct is deemed willful.
They really do. The penalty for a willful violation is the greater of 50% of the account balance, or $100,000.
Yeah.
And this is a detail that needs to sink in. The definition of willful in a civil FBAR context is exceptionally broad.
How broad?
The source emphasizes that recklessness will suffice to meet the standard of willfulness.
Recklessness. That sounds like ignoring a notification or failing to follow up on a vague suspicion rather than an intentional act of tax evasion.
That's the crucial difference. For an IRS agent pursuing a civil penalty, they don't have to prove you knew exactly what you were doing was wrong and intended to break the law.
They just have to show carelessness.
They can prove recklessness by showing you ignored warning signs. Maybe you opened the account offshore and failed to check U.S. reporting rules, or you received a letter from the IRS and simply tossed it. That level of willfulness is a far lower bar than what the criminal standard demands.
And the punishment is 50% of the account value, which could easily exceed the $100,000 threshold. That's an astronomical fine for something classified as mere recklessness.
It is. Now, contrast that with the criminal penalties under 31 U.S.C. 5322.
Okay.
Criminal penalties are required if the violation is willful. You face a fine up to $250,000 or imprisonment up to 5 years, or both.
What's the standard for that type of willfulness?
It's the intentional violation of known legal duty, famously known as the Cheek Standard. This is the traditional definition of criminal intent.
Yeah.
The government has to prove you intentionally knew you had a duty to file and deliberately chose not to.
A significantly higher standard.
Much higher than the civil recklessness threshold, which illustrates the wildly different pathways available to the enforcement agencies.
Moving into high-stakes enforcement and the constitutional challenges, we have to look at the Bittner case from 2023. While Mr. Bittner personally saw a favorable outcome, the source suggests that in the long run, it was a loss for individual Americans facing FBAR scrutiny.
The outcome was narrowly defined. The Supreme Court interpreted 31 U.S.C. 5314 to mean that Treasury could impose only one $10,000 non-willful penalty per year based on the form filed, not based on the number of accounts.
So they limited the penalty for non-willful conduct to $10,000 per year, rather than $10,000 per count per year. That sounds like a massive victory for individuals. Why does the source view it as a loss?
Because the ruling simply defined the current law's interpretation. The source points out the critical caveat. Congress can simply amend the law tomorrow to clearly state that Treasury can impose a penalty per account.
So it was a temporary fix, not a fundamental change.
Exactly. It didn't fundamentally restrict the scope of legislative punitive power.
And the courts have been offering some other checks, though. The constitutional challenges are starting to constrain the system.
That's right. The Sagu case, for example, held that a jury trial is required in certain instances. This relates to the Seventh Amendment, which preserves the right to a jury trial in civil cases over $20.
So when FBAR penalties get big enough, they trigger that constitutional protection.
They transform from being merely administrative fines to civil suits that require a jury.
And then there's the issue of excessive punishment.
Exactly. The Schwartzbaum case introduced another constitutional constraint, holding that FBAR penalties may, in certain circumstances, violate the excessive fines clause of the Eighth Amendment.
Which means the penalty can't be wildly disproportionate to the offense.
Right. If the penalty imposed by the IRS far exceeds the actual harm caused to the government, it can be argued that it is an unconstitutionally excessive fine. These cases are judicial pushback against the severity of the punishment.
But perhaps the most illustrative example of the system operating under this high discretion is the now defunct Offshore Voluntary Disclosure Program, or OVDP.
Yes. The source bluntly described this program as an FBAR fundraiser, or even more darkly, committing suicide to avoid dying.
That phrase, committing suicide to avoid dying, speaks volumes about the immense pressure faced by people caught in this regulatory snare.
This program was aggressively marketed to Americans abroad, who were often completely unaware of citizenship-based taxation and the FBAR requirement.
Let's pause on that. Citizenship-based taxation. For our listeners who may not be familiar, that's the unique U.S. system that taxes citizens based on citizenship, not just residency.
Meaning a U.S. citizen living and working entirely in Germany still has U.S. tax filing obligations.
Correct.
And these people, typically ordinary workers, found themselves years behind on FBARs. Participating in the OVDP program typically involved turning over between 20% and 50% of one's net worth to the IRS in return for avoiding the risk of criminal prosecution.
It sounds less like voluntary disclosure and more like extortion achieved through regulatory capture.
That's certainly the source's perspective. And if you entered the program, you had an opt-out provision, though this was a high-risk gamble. We can see the consequences of this in the Baribeau case involving a New Zealand couple who likely took that risk.
And the IRS sought an enormous $3.5 million in FBAR penalties from them.
The analysis of the Baribeau case is key to understanding the source's critique of punitive intent. The IRS imposed the civil willful penalty, that 50% account balance rule, because Mr. Baribeau had actually filed an FBAR in an earlier distant year.
Wait, filing an FBAR once actually proved the level of knowledge required for willful penalties years later.
That's the tragic irony the source highlights. The knowledge of the prior filing was used as evidence of a known legal duty, even if the subsequent failure to file was due to confusion or simple forgetfulness about the low $10,000 threshold.
Unbelievable.
The source asks, if the true goal is compliance, not punishment, why didn't the IRS simply issue a warning letter? Seeking $3.5 million from an ordinary couple based on a technicality of prior filing underscores the argument that the IRS sought the penalty simply because they want to, utilizing the discretionary power granted by that may language in the statute.
That really brings into focus the layers of complexity we've uncovered. The broad statutory language, the low $10,000 trigger, the explicit power of Treasury to exempt citizens abroad, which they choose not to use, and the judicial limitations imposed on civil penalties by cases like Bittner, Segu, and Schwartzbaum.
What this all synthesizes to is an environment of highly discretionary, highly impactful enforcement. The IRS has the statutory latitude to assert penalties up to those ruinous limits. 50% of account balances for conduct deemed reckless, even though they are not legally required by the statute to assert any civil penalty at all.
And the knowledge gleaned from this deep dive of the discretion, the severity, and the legal ambiguities leads us to the final profound question posed by the source material. The analysis concludes that the weaponization of Mr. FBAR is a sufficient reason to renounce U.S. citizenship. This raises a very serious question for you, the listener. When regulatory compliance, particularly due to the combination of citizenship-based taxation and punitive regulatory discretion, reaches a point of perceived systemic hardship and existential financial threat, does the knowledge we've explored change your perception of the balance between citizenship obligations and the regulatory burden? Something significant to mull over.